Good morning, everyone. I am Lynn Burgess, the Executive Director for ACE, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to remind everyone that the next ACE webinar will be held on December 12th at 11 a.m. Eastern, presented by Melissa Statham on When Technology Hurts, and the registration link is now available on the ACE website. Also, this is a friendly reminder to renew your ACE membership if you haven't already done so, and to make sure that your profile is up to date. During this webinar today, you are going to be able to submit any questions you have via the chat box on your webinar platform. At the end of the webinar, I will relay your questions to our speaker, who will then provide an answer. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the members area of the website later this week. With all that being said, I'm now very pleased to introduce Jason Kumaje who will be presenting the webinar entitled Fatigue Management, Too Tired for Safety? Jason is the Principal Consultant at Optimal Fit, Inc., based in Calgary, Alberta. He brings over 20 years of experience in human factors ergonomics across many industry sectors, including oil and gas, defense, railroad, transportation, and healthcare. Jason has worked with companies to develop and implement fatigue risk management systems and has assisted with the development of industry fatigue risk management guidelines. Jason was president of the Canadian College for the Certification of Professional Ergonomists and held the position of president of the Prairie and Northern Region of ACE. We are thrilled to have you here today, Jason, to do this webinar. I'll hand the mic over to you now if you want to go ahead with your presentation.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I'm really happy to have this opportunity to talk to you about fatigue. The topic of fatigue has actually been one of my interests ever since I graduated. Even before graduating, I graduated from the University of Waterloo back in 1995. I think I've been an ACE member since then, so coming up on 23 years. And I was actually asked by my wife to clean out my hoarded boxes of reports the other day, and I came across one of my first reports related to fatigue. It was during my co-op work term with Canada Post Corporation back in 1990. What is this here? 1991, and it was titled "Physiological Concerns of Shift Work and the Extended Workday." And I remember even back then, as an ergonomist, that this was a topic that was certainly on everyone's mind when it came to shift work, to understand what was the impact of shift work on performance and wellness. And it's still something that we're trying to address in today's society. So it's a pleasure to be here, and today we're going to talk about whether we feel that our workforce and our society is a little bit too tired for safety these days. The goals of the project, or I should say the goals of the presentation, are to really talk about the importance of restorative sleep. So if you come away from this really thinking you should try to get more sleep for yourself, and also think of strategies to improve the quantity and quality of sleep of your workforce, then that's a good outcome. We'll talk about some personal strategies that you can take to manage fatigue. And these are things that you can, again, impart through education or training to your folks to help improve fatigue risk management. And then we'll also get into some organizational strategies. So if you actually have the ability to influence the entire organization that you work in or with, we'll talk about some fatigue risk management system strategies. This includes things we might do to look at the schedules, and it also includes some things that some technologies that we might introduce to help monitor and inform us about fatigue. So we can't talk about fatigue without first defining what it is. And for the purposes of this presentation, we really think of fatigue as a decreased capacity to perform mental or physical workload. And what causes fatigue is often an inadequate restorative amount of sleep, and it can also be influenced by things such as time of day. And by that, we're getting to what are the circadian factors that might be influencing our levels of fatigue, as well as prior wakefulness. So how long have we been up? These are some of the key factors that typically influence the level of fatigue and the fatigue-related risk we have. There's a whole bunch of other things such as workload, sleep inertia, that can also contribute to fatigue. In fact, we'll talk a little bit later about biomathematical fatigue models. And in these software programs where you put in the amount of work or the amount of sleep that people are getting, often the algorithms that are utilized in those biomathematical fatigue models are looking specifically at time of day, prior wakefulness, how long they've been up, how long did they have a break, how long did they have to sleep. All of these factors to really hone in on what is the person's capacity at any point in time to perform mental or physical work. Drowsiness is a bit different. We often use them synonymously, and it's not completely incorrect, but drowsiness tends to be a state of sleepiness accompanied by lethargy. And I guess we can think of fatigue as the battery and drowsiness as the state. So we can actually not be fatigued at all. We can have had good amount of sleep, but because we may be doing a task that doesn't have a high level of arousedness, we may get drowsy during that task. So we're okay from a fatigue perspective, but maybe we're a bit drowsy at that point. So if you're listening to a really boring webinar, you might be faced with some drowsiness, but it might not be specifically due to fatigue-related risk. Hopefully that isn't what you're encountering right now. The key point, only sleep cures fatigue. I'll keep hammering this home, I guess, through the presentation. A lot of people have different strategies, things to do to combat drowsiness, but if we really want to combat fatigue, the key thing is to make sure people get good quantity and good quality of sleep. How does fatigue impact your performance? Well, there's been a number of studies at looking at how fatigue might impact performance. A lot of them look at night shifts. Night shifts are the key factor related to fatigue because they're asking you to work when you're normally sleeping. And that then means that you don't get as much sleep or as quality sleep. And it also means that from a circadian rhythm standpoint, you're working when you're meant to be sleeping. So a lot of things they found were related to night shifts. These are just a few, but in a nutshell, the risk of employee incidents increases during night shifts. So if you do a comparison between day and afternoon shifts compared to night shifts, you'll see a higher degree of risk in employee incidents. In fact, 20% greater chance of involvement in a severe incident. So not only do you have an increased chance of getting an incident, often they're more severe at night. Or with shift work or night shift work. Human errors are twice as frequent during the night shifts, and not only do they occur more frequently, but there's 5 times more chance of making a serious mistake. Serious mistake meaning more serious outcomes from the error. And from a performance standpoint, we have slower reaction times that come with fatigue. We have diminished judgments. So as we get fatigued, we're not as good at judging our own levels of fatigue, for example, or making good decisions, critical decisions at that time when you're fatigued. And even routine tasks can become more difficult, not only from a physical standpoint, but from a cognitive standpoint. So all that being said, it's no wonder that we see fatigue related to some major incidents that have occurred over time. And I'll just give you a few examples of things that when they do the investigations, they found that fatigue is one of the leading or contributing causes of a major incident. And they're across all sectors. So in the nuclear sector, 3 Mile Island explosion or nuclear meltdown happened at 4 a.m. And you'll see this pattern through all these examples where things tend to happen between midnight and 6 a.m. When our circadian rhythms are sort of in their window of circadian low and we're not as alert as we could be. Shift workers in this situation failed to recognize the loss of core coolant water. So even though there were some things being displayed to them, they weren't making good judgments to recognize and really react to that loss of coolant water. In the rail sector, we have the CN Hinton train crash. This happened in 1986, where a CN train actually collided with a passenger train. 23 people were killed. And during the investigation, they found that the crew was very likely to have been asleep at the time. In the rail industry back then, they actually had what was called a dead man's pedal, which was intended to prevent this type of incident where if if the locomotive engineer fell asleep, they would need to keep their foot on a pedal at all times, and if they fell asleep, their foot would lift off of that pedal, and the locomotive would come to a stop. The problem, as they found out during the investigation, is that there was a really easy fix or workaround for the dead man's pedal, and that was to put some large object, a rock, a brick, and place it on that dead man's pedal. So effectively minimizing the effectiveness of that control. We could go into this investigation in a lot of depth, because it really comes down to also what was the culture like at that time. Was this a known workaround, and was it allowed to happen? In any situation, this crash woke up the rail industry to do some inquiry into what they could do to look at schedules and what strategies they could do to hopefully prevent crew fatigue in the locomotives. And that's still ongoing. Another meltdown, the Chernobyl meltdown, again happened at about 1:30 a.m. And in this situation, again, safety features were turned off by overworked, tired crew. In the oil and gas industry, there was a BP Texas City explosion. 15 people were killed, 180 were injured. There was a huge blast radius for this explosion. And in the course of the investigation, they found that some of the workers who were in charge of monitoring the systems had been on 12-hour shifts for 33 consecutive days. So fatigue was definitely a factor in their decision-making abilities of those workers at the time. The Space Shuttle Challenger, a lot of factors were contributed to this incident, but one of them was that operator fatigue and excessive overtime were cited as major contributors. Some of the people who had been working up until the launch of the Challenger, which was under great pressure to have success, were working 6-day work weeks, or equivalent of 6-day work weeks, for the 3 months prior to the incident. And even in freight and in shipping, we saw that Exxon Valdez captain fell asleep, but it was the third mate who was in control. And not only did they make a poor decision in programming the GPS, they found that one of the contributing causes for that running aground and not following the proper route was possibly due to fatigue or excessive workload. And again, that happened just after midnight. So a lot of things are happening that can be major incidents, but even in our personal lives, we are faced with fatigue and can have horrible outcomes. This picture actually shows an incident that occurred in Ontario that was attributed to a driver falling asleep, and you can see just how bad the incident is. When we have accidents that relate to a fatigued driver or someone who falls asleep, we tend to see them being very serious, because the driver is in an impaired state where they're completely unable to actually push the brake or to take evasive actions. So we see some really horrible collisions when it comes to falling asleep and driving. A study by Selkirk College actually found that 3/4 of drivers report having fatigue-related incidents at least once per month. So this is a really common thing, and people admit to it in this study. And yet, when they ask those same drivers if they are effectively managing their fatigue, 70% of them still feel that they're doing it. So there's something with our society where we feel that driving, which can have horrible outcomes if we fall asleep or in a fatigue-related incident, we still feel that we're effectively managing them. And this is a human condition where we're not really equating how we feel with how we're performing. Again, fatigue is one of those nefarious topics, because one of the things that we are not good at doing once we become fatigued is actually judging our levels of fatigue. And so we take risks. We take greater risks than we really should, and we underestimate the amount of risk related to how we're feeling. So to take this to what do you do? Maybe you have specific strategies. in workshops that we've conducted in the past, what we find are all kinds of strategies people tell us. And these are things people tell us. They turn up the radio, sing along with the radio, they blast cold air, they sing, they chew gum. One of my workmates, one of the workshop members indicated that they like to get ice chips and chew on those. So that was what kept them awake while they were driving. Slapping your face, tickling the roof of your mouth, and even in extreme, stopping to run around the vehicle twice. So these are strategies that can increase our arousal levels. But when we do studies and we look at people, what we find is if you're not maintaining this over time, and if you're in a fatigue state, these are not going to be effective over the long term. What is effective? Sleep. Only sleep cures fatigue. And again, getting good quantity sleep, good quality sleep is the remedy for fatigue. And if you're driving, if you're getting some yawning, any indicators of drowsiness due to fatigue, be sure to pull over, get in a safe area, and actually close those eyes. Take a nap, recover. It's the best thing you can do to overcome that feeling of fatigue. How much sleep do people need, or how much do they get on average? Most people require about 7 to 8 hours. Everyone's genetically slightly different, but 7 to 8 hours tends to be the average. And depending on what your requirement is, missing out on even 1 hour of sleep has been shown to increase physiological sleepiness the next day. So it doesn't take a lot of poor quantity or quality of sleep to impact your performance, both mentally and physiologically the next day. One of the things we get asked the most is, don't we train ourselves to require less sleep? Your body needs the amount of sleep that it requires. That's a constant. What we do train ourselves is adapting to the feeling of being tired all the time. But it is not changing the amount of sleep you biologically need. Are there times of the day you feel more tired? This gets to the circadian rhythms. Circadian means about a day, and this means that every 24 hours, our body kind of goes through these natural rhythms. Often it's related to body temperature, so I'm going to see if I can get fancier. So when we see, just 1 second, I'm going to see if I can actually write on here. Oh, it's not working. Tried to get fancy, but as we there's points in the day where our body temperature, our production of enzymes, our digestion, they all slow down because our body is in a state where it's ready or wanting to sleep. Then around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, we start to see the climb in those rhythms because we're trying to get our body more alert. We're exposed to the sun, and so we're ready to actually do activities, to do a lot of thinking and activity. And then around 8 at night, we reach our peak and we start to go back down. We get exposed to darkness, which suppresses a lot of the things which are required for the circadian rhythms to go up. Melatonin starts to be produced because we don't have light, and our arousal levels and our body temperatures, our circadian rhythms start to go down. They reach a dip down. The window of circadian low is this sort of area at the very bottom around 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. This is when we're at the lowest circadian state. And then we start to go into an increased state as our body prepares to wake up and go through that circadian cycle again. So again, it's no surprise that in this area at night, especially during the circadian low, this is where we are more prone to those incidents and serious accidents that we talked about earlier. This picture shows the suprachiasmatic nucleus. This is what's in our brain and is very responsible for regulating our circadian rhythms, and what's sort of responsible for regulating the suprachiasmatic nucleus is actually exposure to light. So light comes in through our eye, and it triggers the suprachiasmatic nucleus to trigger all those circadian rhythms. So what can you do, or what can you promote as solutions for sleeping? There's 10 here that I'll go through very quickly. Buy a good bed, get some good blankets and pillows. We spend about a third of our life in bed, so it's probably one of the better investments you can make. We spend more time in our bed than in our cars, so why don't we spend a bit of money and get some good beds? Associate the bedroom with sleep and positive emotions, and try not to be awake in that bedroom area. Try not to make it your area where you go when you're worried, when bad things happen, or even to do work. If you can associate your bed with sleep, it can help to program your expectations about what happens in that area versus thinking that you're primed to do other things in that area. One of the things you can also get out of the bedroom to prime you for sleep is get the TV out of the bedroom. The TV requires very minimal attention, but can keep us up. Removing it from the equation can help ensure we get the sleep we need. Lower the temperature in your room. When we're sleeping, our body actually likes to be a little bit cooler than what you would expect to have during a daylight when your body temperature is up and your circadian rhythms are moving us around. So lower that temperature. That can help improve sleep. Also ensure good air circulation. Develop a pre-sleep routine. Our body and our mind likes consistency. If you have kids, you know that this is a good strategy. Always have the same routine, so kids know what to expect. Brush the teeth, have a bath, read a book, turn out the lights. These are all cues and routinized, consistent things that can help the body be prepared, the body and the mind be prepared for sleeping. Try to get it pitch dark or as dark as possible in your sleep environment. As we sleep or as we're get accustomed to the dark, our eyes can be very sensitive to light. And as I indicated in the previous slides, any light entering the eyes is what will maybe trigger or impact that suprachiasmatic nucleus. And so we want to reduce even the minimal amount of light. Even a night light can be very bright at night. So think about what you might do to make your environment as dark as possible. In the same way, we're very sensitive to noises when we're trying to sleep. Some are deep sleepers, some are light sleepers. Whatever you can do to reduce noises and disturbances will help. And a lot of us are these days going to bed with our iPads and our iPhones or our electronic smartphones. If at all possible, don't bring those into the bedroom. Again, they emit light, and light, again, as we said before, can impact that suprachiasmatic nucleus and our desire to go to sleep. There are filters that now exist on a lot of the phones. This can reduce the blue light emitted from your phone during nighttime hours, so it can help to reduce the impact of the light on your brain and your rhythms, but it's better altogether to just remove them from the equation. And often we suggest screening for sleep disorders. You may be somebody who is actually going to sleep early and getting up 8 hours later, but you're still tired. It's possible that you need to be screened for some sleep disorders. Some things like sleep apnea are very common, where we're continuously waking up at night. Not enough to wake us up completely, but enough to disturb our sleep and prevent us from getting into some deep sleep, restorative sleep areas. Some people have restless leg syndrome, move around quite a bit. Some of us need to get up a lot to go to the washroom. All of these things can impact the quantity and quality of sleep. And there are some sleep disorder screening tests or things you can do to identify whether these are maybe contributing to why you may be feeling tired. All right, so now we're going to move on. Just going to do a time check here. Now we're going to move on to what organizations might be able to do to address fatigue-related risk. And one of the things that we promote are management systems, the management systems approach or fatigue risk management system. And what we're talking about with these are a set of guiding principles that form the strategic framework of your fatigue management program. So this is really a systems approach as suggested by the title. So we're not looking specifically at individuals or regarding any errors that occur related to fatigue as consequences. Sorry, we're looking at we are looking at them as consequences and we're looking at them as consequences of the system. And so we really need in a management system approach to look at all the different variables in a systems approach or in a system that are contributing to fatigue. So what am I trying to say with that? First off, there's a lot of guidance and regulations now being developed because fatigue is becoming recognized as a variable contributing to poor health, wellness, and contributing to incidents. For example, in the oil and gas sector, I've listed a number of different regulations and guidance documents that are being developed. This is something that whatever sector you're in, you can probably find some guidance document or some standards that are being specifically developed for your sector. While the management systems tend to follow the same types of strategies, customizing them to your sector is exactly what these standards and guidelines do. In the oil and gas sector, for example, NFORM, which is an upstream oil and gas safety association, they went through a process where they first had to develop some fatigue risk management guiding principles. And in this situation, what they needed to do as an industry sector was recognize in writing that fatigue was an actual thing and it was something that they wanted to address. That was the first step to formalize their commitment and understanding that fatigue was something they needed to manage in their industry. Following that, they came up with some fatigue risk management guidance document. And in any sector, this is sort of the next step, is where there's some guidance document to help give guidance, become the de facto standard for how people and companies within the sector can manage risk. And within that development guide, they sort of have a fatigue risk management model or systems approach. So at the very start, you want to initiate a fatigue risk management program. This requires actual assessment of what you're doing well and what you're not doing well from a fatigue risk management perspective. Identify who the stakeholders are, collect information, and engage stakeholders. This will then help you to develop the program components. And in any fatigue risk management system, you need continuous improvement. The management systems approach is really one in which it's sort of a plan, do, check, and act. If you're not continuously doing that development cycle, then you're not going to really improve fatigue over the long term. Almost all fatigue risk management systems also consider the fatigue-related incident trajectory. This is sort of recognizing that we go from a state of alertness to a state of fatigue, and there's a number of different points along that trajectory where we have opportunities to prevent the fatigue-related incident. We may provide sleep opportunity to the workers. The workers are then required to obtain sleep with those opportunities provided. Fatigue-related behaviors. This indicates that we need strategies in the system to identify when fatigue might be evident or present and what to do in those situations. And also fatigue-related error. So if there are near misses or an actual fatigue-related incident, we need strategies to investigate those, identify if fatigue was a contributing factor, and determine how we can then implement mitigations and controls to design those out of the system for the future. This is an example of a proposed fatigue risk management system for a rail industry. They were very familiar with the Reason Swiss cheese model, so we put it in that perspective for them to see that along the fatigue trajectory, again, there's a number of defenses or layers of cheese that we can put in place as defenses. There's things that the employer is accountable to provide, and there's things that the employee is accountable to do, and there's also things, requirements to investigate and correct things as they're discovered. In this situation, we suggested things they could do at each one of those levels. I won't go into too much detail here other than to say at the very first level, when we're trying to ensure people and workers have enough opportunity to sleep, we can use biomathematical fatigue modeling to look at their schedules to ensure it is minimizing the risk related to those schedules. We can provide training and awareness to employees so that they can ensure they get the best quantity and quality of sleep with the opportunities provided by the company. We can use technologies such as in-vehicle monitors to actually monitor the levels of fatigue in real time, so that we can actually see if fatigue is an issue for the operations. And then we can be sure that in the investigations or whenever there are reports of fatigue-related issues, there is a strategy to investigate those and make sure that considerations for fatigue are considered. I spoke quickly about biomathematical modeling, biomathematical fatigue modeling. This is an example of one type of biomathematical fatigue model. There's at least 6 or 7 out there that are used in aviation and rail industries, and that can be used in almost any other industry. In reality, what they're doing is you're entering the start and end times of the shifts, the planned shifts, or the actual shifts of your workers. You then run the report, and it will tell you how many hours are in the green, how many hours are in the yellow, and how many hours are in the red, red being at higher fatigue-related risk. So if you see in the graph here, you can see a 5-day schedule of 12-hour shifts. You can see for the first 2 days, we're in the green. In the third day, we're starting to get into the yellow. And on the last 2 days, we're definitely have some portion of those shifts in the red. And if you were to zoom in, you could see, actually this is a zoom in, this graph up here is a zoom in on one of those. You can see that the risk is actually at the tail end of those shifts. And so using this information, we can say that perhaps this schedule is going to pose too much risk for a worker, and we can maybe reschedule. If rescheduling isn't an option, at least we have awareness to know that there's higher risk at the end of those shifts. And so risk assessment or strategies can be put in place to work with those operators to say, let's have a risk assessment before you drive home. Is it possible that you can ride with somebody else home, or do you need to actually have a nap or stay over before commuting home? So it gives you more information about exactly where risk might be in your schedules and in your operations, and develop specific strategies to address them. Technology to the rescue. This is a clear question mark. This is a display, the speedometer on a Mercedes-Benz, and we see more and more vehicles having driver assistance devices in them. Fatigue and drowsy driving is certainly one of the things that car manufacturers are looking into. In this situation, based on how you're driving in terms of whether you're doing quick corrections with the steering wheel, whether you're lane departing, whether you're doing very aggressive braking, all of these go into whatever the manufacturer's algorithm is, and at points they'll give you a little message that you may be drowsy, and to employ some drowsiness countermeasures. A company I worked with called Six Safety Systems, they have another device which looks actually at your eyes. It has infrared sensor that looks at the state of your eyes, and it can see how often you're blinking, how droopy your eyes are, and based on the algorithm in the Lucy system, as they call it, it can determine your level of drowsiness. So if you are in the green, it'll display information that suggests you're okay to drive. If you're starting to get in the yellow, we're starting to see yawning or indications of droopiness over time. You might be in the yellow. This gives feedback directly to the operator so that they can take action. And these systems can also be connected to a journey management program or control center or supervisor, so that if you actually then get into the red, perhaps alerts can be sent to somebody else so that they can give you a call connect with you, ask you to pull over, do a bit of a risk assessment just to be certain that you're okay to continue, or whether some controls have to be put into place. These were actually put into a very Canadian application, the snowplows at YY Calgary Airport. Oops. Let me just see if we can play this. I'm hoping the video is working for people, but I'll just play this. And again, you place this so that it can see their eyes, it can look through their glasses. And in this situation, they were concerned that their snowplow drivers, they can sort of be in a state of drowsiness because of the task, where there's a lot of snow blowing around them. It kind of develops this hypnotic state. They often have to do this at night. They often get called in after not knowing whether they're going to get called in. So they might have had a day of being awake and then be called in to work a night shift in a very repetitive task. And so they wanted to take a look at what the potential fatigue was in their cabs while driving. And another thing from a management system approach is to do an audit. Often when we go into a company, we start by doing what we call a needs assessment or gap analysis. This is a way to actually look at a snapshot of what they have in place from a fatigue risk management system standpoint and identify what gaps they might have to improve on. So any fatigue risk management system will have these 6 key elements, any management system really. And so we have a number of questions that look at their culture, their commitment to addressing fatigue, and how they're engaging people on the topic, what their strategic plan is, how do they do their hazard identification and risk assessments, what type of risk controls do they have in place, how do they evaluate those controls, and do they track the corrective actions to see how effective they've been or if they've been completed. And then continuous improvement. As we suggested before, any management system needs to continuously be assessed, audited, reviewed, and take those learnings to start informing the system. To give you an example of the process, a number of questions, over 100 questions are asked, so this can be a time-consuming process, but it's very thorough. Really, for each element and for each sub-element and for each question, people identify whether they're compliant, partially compliant, or they don't have anything in place for a number of different factors, and that then gives them a score on each of the key elements and sub-elements. So this is some of the results that we had for Calgary Airport, just to give you a taste of how this type of system can work. We looked at their organizational culture, commitment, and engagement, and they had some really good things. Workers were encouraged to report when they were tired. They did allow napping as a strategy. Senior management understood that they had accountability for any fatigue-related incidents, and employees did participate in the shift scheduling discussions. However, there were some gaps. They didn't have a comprehensive or documented fatigue risk management system, so they had a number of pieces, but they didn't have a formal document to coordinate it and to refer to. And senior management actually had still high expectations for productivity and low staffing, which sometimes trumped the desire to manage fatigue. And that's very common in most organizations. They want to minimize those, but there was definitely room for improvement. I won't go through all of the areas, but in the hazard identification and risk analysis element, they again had some good things. They were doing incident investigations that were looking for fatigue, but they didn't have any formal fatigue risk assessments of fatigue inducing tasks. So they didn't know which tasks might be more prone to fatigue versus others. And in terms of risk controls, again, they did a number of good things. They had consistent schedules with advance notice of changes so they could know what day they were going to work or potentially work. However, they didn't really have any monitoring devices or ways to actually manage fatigue on a day-to-day basis. So this is just to give you a taste of an assessment that can be done to identify where an organization is in relation to fatigue and what they could do to improve. And really, what was tried to be accomplished by doing these is to really shift people's and organizations' paradigm around what is their response to be related to fatigue. Um, Often fatigue is not seen as a component of fit for duty. If we go into organizations and we ask them, do you have a policy and process around drug and alcohol testing? Often they'll say, yes, we have a very strong policy. We know what our procedures are, and we recognize that we want people not to come to work influenced by drugs and alcohol. When we ask them, do you have something on psychological health? And they'll say, yes, that's part of the fit for duty equation. It's important that we have policies and procedures in place to ensure there's no bullying, there's no sexual harassment, and that people are not too stressed when they come to work. And then if you ask them, do you consider fatigue in your fit for duty equation, often they don't see it in there. When in actuality, regulations would state that fatigue is one of the considerations you need for fit for duty. So we really just need to shift people's paradigms, organizations' paradigms, to see fatigue as important as your drug and alcohol policies and your physical and mental health policies, because it is a high contributor to risk, and if we address it, we can have really optimized performance in organizations. So my last slide. I'm a big Bear Grylls fan. He is a survivalist, and like any survivalist, they usually have a rule of three. If you're ever caught out in the woods, there's a rule of three, and it talks about how long you can go without oxygen, how long you can go without shelter, how long can you go without water, how long can you go without food, and it usually doesn't address sleep. Usually it says we can go without oxygen for about 3 minutes, then we're in very much danger. We can go without shelter for about 3 hours. We can go without water for 3 days, and we go without food for 3 weeks. I would propose that when it comes to sleep, there's a rule of three as well, and that's that we need to avoid, whenever possible, being awake or doing critical tasks at 3 a.m. So that's my take on the survival rule of threes. You can see that the circadian rhythms dip during 3 a.m. and this is when incidents occur. So try to be sleeping during that time and try to avoid safety critical tasks. And if you do have to be working and doing safety critical tasks at 3 a.m., make sure that you have a strong fatigue risk management system in place with a number of defenses that will help to minimize any fatigue related risk at that time. So I've talked up my limit here. It's 45 minutes. I want to thank you for your time. I hope there's some good questions out there and that I haven't lost you all and you've gone to sleep during my fatigue presentation. A lot of the discussion points was written up in Ergonomics Canada back in 2015. Little article there that talks about fatigue and some of the principles that I spoke of today. That article was written by myself and with my colleague Mike Harnett. So hopefully
Thanks, Jason. That's great. I see some people are typing right
now.
I found the napping as a strategy for some corporations. I found that
answer any questions you might have.
Interesting. And the Lucy system as well. That was interesting to hear about that. We have somebody who just wants to say that was very interesting. Thank you. And I see that we've got a couple more people who are typing right now. So we'll just give them a second to submit their questions.
Sure, napping is really a interesting topic. It's again, there's the stigma of sleeping at work is not really. It's very much frowned upon in our society, but I think there's going to be a shift in that as the paradigm changes to recognize that there's strategic ways to nap and to get restorative sleep. and reducing that stigma to say it's a bad thing and
Okay,
say
here's a
that if
question
it
for
is
you.
necessary, it's a
Would the
great thing, is
BFMs
something
even
that
bother with
is starting to be developed in organizations.
Would the BFMs even bother with assessing a shift schedule that is 12 days in a row, 24 hours including on call in an EMR?
If, if yes, you can certainly use biomathematical models to model any types of shifts. Often what you'll see with those types of shift is they very quickly go into the high risk level after a certain amount of days. So yes, they can be utilized for that. We've used them to educate people to identify what the impact is of 12-hour shifts. But again, biomathematical fatigue modeling just looks at the schedule and considers a few factors around what the fatigue-related risk might be. That's your starting point. So even if you have fatigue in the red, it doesn't mean that you can't do those schedules, but it can suggest that you need to knowingly develop strategies to minimize the impact of fatigue, specifically in those schedules, and have strategies and awareness
Does the
around what you
use
can
of
do during those
caffeine
shifts to
or
minimize
ephedrine, etc.,
incidents related
actually
to fatigue.
increase cognitive wakefulness or
Hopefully
just
I addressed your
provide the illusion?
Great question. I went to a conference and the military's done a lot of work on caffeine and the impact, and they actually have it very strategically incorporated into some of their schedules and operations to increase alertness and increase their cognitive functioning during certain operations. So there's definitely strategic ways that have been found that are research driven to use caffeine to
Do you
maximize
have
your
any
alertness
experience with sleep
and
apps
also
that
as a
measure your sleep
countermeasure for
level,
fatigue.
i.e., the quality of sleep?
Yeah, the sleep apps, they're all based on actigraphy, sort of the accelerometers and the things in the actigraphy. So some of the comments that I've heard is how accurate are those just from a hardware standpoint to monitor your activity. And then on top of that accuracy in the hardware, what is every different company like Fitbit or Samsung, they all have their own app with different algorithms on how to interpret that information um, to predict your level of sleep and quality of sleep. Um, I personally think they're pretty good. Um, I know that there's a lot of research going into them to compare what the actual sleep is compared to what the predictions are, and they're getting stronger. A lot of the criticisms of Fitbit type of technologies is that they aren't accurate for heart rate and shouldn't be used for diagnostics. But when it comes to the sort of the activity and vibration, it's a little bit more accurate. So I think they are quite good at helping to provide information about your levels of quantity and quality of sleep. Um, they're certainly good to, on a personal level, they're very good to give you an awareness of what's happening with yourself.
Okay, great.
And
Is there
and to
guidance on
compare
what
yourself over
environment is
time to see a
appropriate for
profile,
napping?
it is really helpful. Yeah. Um, Definitely. There's good sleep hygiene guidance. If you're asking for a specific reference, I don't want to have one off you can certainly contact me later, and I can send you some information around what is typically given as guidance for sleep environments. Those personal strategies I went through tend to hit on some of those key elements. You want it to be dark, you want it to be cool, you want it to be uh, not a lot of disturbances or noises. So those are some of the key variables. But yes, often if you go into
Okay, that's great. I'm wondering
the
too if you
research,
have any
you'll see that there's
references
a number
or
of
articles.
checklist
Maybe you could
items for
send
any
them to me
environment
and I
to
can include
optimize it
them
for
on
sleep.
the website when we post your recording. Okay. Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, I have one more question here. If rail
Sure, yeah.
companies are
I
using
just don't have
biomath
them right now,
modeling and
but
still having
there are definitely
accidents,
lists that exist out there.
where are their programs failing?
Um, well, partially it's how they're using the biomathematical models. So models can be used in a number of different ways. They can be used proactively um, to optimize the schedules before they are issued. Um, but often in operations, the plan isn't what is actually done. So this so the tools can be used to optimize, but especially in the rail industry, things are not cannot be scheduled all the time. There's sort of things happen. Clients ask for things at different times, and so everything sort of is being changed in real time. And so often what we're seeing in fatigue in the rail industry is because there may be plans that use biomathematical modeling to optimize things as well as possible, but then in real time, things change. And sometimes the decisions that are made by both the organization and by the workers increase the fatigue related risk. Um, so I think they're in the right directions where they're using it to inform them and to track and to learn. Um, but it's still an ongoing process.
Sorry, Jason, we're still here.
Oh, hello.
So that is it. Oh, we have one more question coming
Hi,
up.
Lynn. Are you still there?
If
Mm-mm.
anyone else has a question, just feel free to type it in the chat box.
Okay.
Great. So someone said thank you for the answer. Yes, that was a great presentation. Another thank you. Thank you very much, Jason. Another very interesting. So it seems the consensus is it was wonderful. And someone wishes the theory would apply better to his kids. Okay, Jason, I
Yes.
just want to thank you on behalf of ACE for the
Yes, there's
presentation. It
probably a
was
whole
very
other
well
presentation
received
just
and
on
very
managing fatigue
interesting.
in the family
And
environment.
I will put the recording on the members only area and your PowerPoint as well. And again, if you have any references, certainly we can put them there as well. So, thanks again, Jason. I really appreciate it.